a black doctor, fresh off a 12-hour shift at the hospital, exhausted but eager to get home, steps into a high-end cafe for a quick coffee. But the moment he walks in, everything changes. A barista, eyes sharp with judgment, immediately assumes he doesn't belong. She refuses to serve him. When he calmly asks why, she scoffs, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear, and tells him, "We have the right to refuse service." What happens next? In just 10 minutes, a shocking truth is revealed. The barista is left speechless, and the entire cafe is forced to confront a reality they can no longer ignore. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. It all started as just another day, but it didn't stay that way for long. The air inside the terminal was heavy, not with the rush of travelers, nor the scent of fast food wafting from overpriced stalls, but with something unspoken, something thick and undeniable. David Brooks stood at the gate, his boarding pass firm in his grip, the ink still fresh from the kiosk. He had done this before. Flown alone, walked through spaces not meant for him, sat in places where people questioned his right to be. Yet today, there was something different, or perhaps not different at all, just more pronounced, more obvious in the way eyes glanced at him and away again. How shoulders stiffened when he stepped closer. How the silence around him took on a particular quality, like waiting for an inevitable storm. He was dressed plainly, but with care, a pressed button-down, slacks, shoes shined just enough to suggest that he took himself seriously. He had learned long ago that presentation mattered, that the world would always see him before it heard him. But it never truly mattered. Not in the way that erased suspicion. Not in the way that made others see him as anything other than what they had already decided. A voice rang out over the intercom. First-class passengers may now board. David stepped forward, boarding pass extended. The woman at the counter, blonde, middle-aged, a polite but tight smile on her face, barely glanced at him before hesitating. "This is for first class, sir," she said. "I know," David replied evenly. She looked at the ticket now, properly, blinking as if processing an error. But it was no mistake. Her lips parted, then closed. Finally, she forced a brighter smile. "Of course. Right this way." Behind him, he could hear the shuffling of feet, the murmurs, the subtle shift of discomfort. He did not turn around. He had been in this moment too many times before. On streets where his presence was questioned. In stores where security shadowed his movements. In rooms where his voice had to be twice as measured, twice as calm, just to be half as accepted. As he stepped onto the plane, he felt it before he saw it. The tension, the momentary hush of conversation as he made his way to his seat in first class. A woman in pearls, seated across the aisle, pulled her purse closer. The man beside her, tall, suited, a Wall Street type, glanced at David, his expression unreadable, then returned to his newspaper, as if deliberately signaling disinterest. David placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, settled into his seat, and exhaled. The flight attendants moved through their routines, their voices bright and rehearsed. Yet he noticed how their gazes skimmed past him. Then, the first real test. A flight attendant, a young woman with a crisp uniform and an air of barely concealed irritation, paused beside him. "Sir, are you comfortable?" Her tone carried an edge, the kind that pretended to be helpful but wasn't. David looked up. "I am." She hesitated. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" He took his time, met her gaze, let the weight of it settle. Then he nodded toward his boarding pass, resting on the tray table. "I'm where I'm supposed to be," he said. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, perhaps both, crossed her face. Then she was gone, walking away without another word. Across the aisle, the woman with the pearls pursed her lips. David leaned back against the seat. He had not raised his voice, had not made a scene. Yet already, the battle had begun. And it was only the beginning. The engines hummed low, steady, like the distant growl of a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The air inside the first-class cabin remained thick, silent but weighted with an understanding and spoken by the passengers but deeply felt by David. The woman with the pearls shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking toward him like a reflex she couldn't control. The suited man beside her had flipped the page of his newspaper but had yet to truly read a word. There was an order to these spaces, a quiet understanding about who belonged where. And David, despite his polished shoes, his pressed shirt, his presence bought and paid for, was out of place in their world. The flight attendant reappeared, the same one who had questioned his seat. She carried a tray of champagne flutes, offering them with bright, controlled smiles to each passenger as she moved down the aisle. When she reached David, however, her hand hesitated, the tray pausing mid-air. "Would you prefer something else?" she asked. Her voice soft, polite, but with an unmistakable lilt that suggested her question meant something more than the words alone. David glanced at the glass, then back at her. "Is there a reason I shouldn't take the champagne?" She blinked. No, of course not. But it was too late. The moment had already stretched between them. The hesitation already observed by the others around him. He could hear it in the rustling of clothes, the sharp but fleeting pauses in conversations. David reached for the glass. Slow, deliberate, his fingers curled around the stem, lifted it from the tray with precision, as if performing a test of his own. He met her gaze just long enough for her to understand that he had noticed that he was aware of every unspoken rule she was following. The flight attendant moved on quickly. David took a sip. The bubbles fizzed against his tongue, bitter in a way that had nothing to do with the drink itself. Minutes passed. Then, another shift. The businessman in the suit cleared his throat, folding his newspaper and setting it aside. "What line of work are you in?" he asked. His voice casual, but David recognized the question for what it was. It wasn't a curiosity. It was an assessment. "I'm a professor," David replied evenly. The man nodded, as if he had expected something else. "Ah." A pause. Then, "What do you teach?" David let the silence stretch a little before answering. "History." The man's mouth twitched. Just a flicker, but enough to reveal something beneath his carefully composed expression. He nodded again, slower this time, as if recalculating. "Well," the man said, reaching for his drink, "that's an interesting field." David smiled, just enough to let the man know he had seen the calculation in real time, and watched him decide that he could, in fact, allow David to sit beside him without discomfort. He had played this game before, knew how it worked. The turbulence began, not in the sky, but in the small moments that chipped away at the illusion of civility. A flight attendant passed with a hot towel service. David watched as she offered each passenger a small, neatly folded cloth, her hands gliding effortlessly from one seat to the next. When she reached him, her tray tilted slightly, the warm towel sliding just out of place. "Oh," she said quickly, catching it before it fell. "Sorry about that. It was nothing. A small mistake. Except that it wasn't. It was in the way she exhaled just a little too sharply. In the way her shoulders stiffened, as if bracing herself for a reaction that she assumed would come." David took the towel, nodded. "No problem." She hesitated, then moved on. The woman in pearls shifted again, her fingers toying with the edge of her clutch. It was in the air now, thick enough for anyone attuned to such things to feel it. David leaned back in his seat. He had been here before. Not in this exact first-class cabin. Not on this particular flight. But in this moment, in spaces where the expectation was clear, exist. But do not disturb. Be present, but do not disrupt the carefully curated illusion of power, of order, of ownership. The turbulence outside had yet to begin. But inside the cabin, it had already started. David was no stranger to turbulence. Not the kind that rattled the plane, but the kind that made itself known in glances that lingered too long, in questions disguised as conversation, in the way space itself seemed to shift around him. The air in the first-class cabin had grown heavier, though no one acknowledged it. It was in the small, almost imperceptible changes. The woman in pearls no longer shifted, she sat still, her hands folded neatly over her lap, as if to keep herself from touching anything around her. The businessman beside him had picked up his newspaper again but wasn't reading. His eyes darted toward David every so often. Quick and measuring. The flight attendant's smile had tightened. Just slightly, but enough for David to notice. He knew what they were all thinking. The equilibrium of their world had been disrupted. Not by anything he had done, but by the simple fact of his presence. David turned his attention to the window. Watching the soft white of the clouds stretch endlessly below them, he thought about the countless black men before him who had occupied spaces just like this. Men who had paid for their tickets, walked through the same doors, only to find themselves still being asked, in 1,000 different ways, to prove they belonged. The voice of the captain crackled through the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude, their estimated time of arrival. A smooth flight ahead, he promised. But David knew better. A shift. A new figure entered the scene. A second flight attendant. A tall man with sharp features and the kind of smile that held nothing warm. Moved toward him, stopping just beside his seat. His presence was different from the first attendant's. His energy more deliberate. "Sir," the attendant said, his voice neutral, professional, but laced with something underneath. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." David looked up at him. He didn't move. "Excuse me?" The flight attendant's smile didn't change. But the pressure in the air did. "Just a routine check, sir. We've had some, seating errors in the past." A lie. A thin one. David exhaled through his nose. He could feel the eyes on him. Feel the weight of the cabin pressing in. "I wasn't aware this was standard protocol," David said, his voice even. The attendant didn't blink. "It won't take long." David reached into his jacket pocket. Slow. Deliberate. Not because he had anything to hide, but because he knew that every movement he made in this space had consequences. He pulled out his boarding pass, unfolded it with careful precision, and handed it over. The attendant took it, scanning it for far longer than necessary. David had seen this before. It wasn't about checking. It was about making him wait. About reminding him. The businessman beside him cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. The woman in pearls adjusted her necklace. They all felt it. Finally, the attendant handed the boarding pass back. "Apologies for the inconvenience," he said, his voice still smooth, still unshaken. But David wasn't fooled. He knew what this was. "No problem," David said, taking the pass back, folding it neatly. His voice was steady, but his fingers curled tightly around the paper. The flight attendant nodded, stepped away, and disappeared down the aisle. A beat of silence. Then, the businessman beside him spoke. "Probably just a misunderstanding," he said, almost as if to himself. David smiled without humor. Probably. The turbulence outside had yet to begin. But inside the cabin, the shaking had already started. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet. Conversations resumed, though they carried a different tone now. Hushed and restrained, as if the air had thickened with something unspoken. David could feel it, how the moment lingered, how the tension in the room hadn't quite dissolved but had instead settled like a fine dust, coating every surface. The flight attendant had walked away. But the act itself remained. A stain that would not be wiped clean with a simple, forced apology. The businessman beside him cleared his throat again, shifting in his seat. He hadn't looked at David since speaking. Since attempting to smooth over what they both knew had not been a misunderstanding. David let the silence stretch between them. A new figure entered the equation. A young woman, seated 2 rows ahead, turned slightly in her seat. She had dark curls pulled back into a loose bun, and her expression was hard to read. But David caught the look in her eyes. Uncertainty, discomfort, and beneath it all, something close to recognition. She hesitated before speaking. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice low. David studied her. She swallowed. That wasn't right. The businessman tensed beside him. Though he said nothing, David tilted his head slightly. What wasn't right? The woman hesitated. The question hung between them, heavy with implication. She had seen it. They all had. But it was one thing to witness something. It was another to name it. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. And in that moment, David saw the battle she was fighting within herself. He had seen it before. In 1,000 different ways. From 1,000 different people. To speak was to acknowledge. To confirm that the world was not as neat and fair as they liked to believe. To stay silent was to let the world remain as it was. She looked away, pressing her lips together. David smiled to himself. But it was a sad thing. Humorless. The flight attendant returned. Not the man from before. But the first woman. The one who had greeted him stiffly when he had first boarded. Her smile was still tight. Still forced. But there was something behind it now. Something cautious. She leaned slightly toward him. Would you like another drink, sir? David looked at her. It was an offering. A weak one. But an offering nonetheless. He could take it. Accept the olive branch and let the moment pass. Let the air return to its previous state. Let the weight of what had happened be buried beneath the hum of the engine and the clinking of ice in crystal glasses. Or he could refuse. He could remind them all that nothing had changed. That the turbulence had not passed. That it still rumbled beneath their feet. He glanced at the businessman beside him. At the woman in the row ahead. At the others who were watching. Pretending not to. And then he smiled. No, thank you, he said, his voice even. The flight attendant's relief was visible. Though she tried to mask it. She nodded, stepping away. And just like that, the moment was allowed to slip back into the shadows. To disappear into the folds of silence where so many others like it had been buried before. But David knew better. It had not disappeared. It had only been deferred. The plane cut through the sky. The sound of the engines humming beneath the surface of conversation. The silence from before had been replaced by something else. A fragile, uneasy balance. As if the entire cabin had agreed. Without words. To let the moment pass. But David knew better. There was no passing. Only postponement. He could feel it in the way the businessman beside him had straightened his tie twice now. In the way the young woman 2 rows ahead kept shifting in her seat. As if debating whether to turn around. And then there was the flight attendant. She had returned twice now. Offering small pleasantries. Checking if his tray table was comfortable. If he needed anything. If he was enjoying the flight. But David understood what this was. It was not concern. It was a need to restore order. The same kind of order he had seen in boardrooms. In restaurants. In hotel lobbies and government buildings. The kind of order that existed to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. But everything was not fine. He looked up as the same flight attendant. The one who had ignored him before. Now approached again. Her smile was polished. Her voice gentle. Rehearsed. Would you like to take a moment to stretch your legs, sir? We have a bit of extra space toward the front. David tilted his head. There it was. The subtle attempt to move him. To remove him from the space where he had been seen. Where the tension had been felt. His presence was a disruption. And disruptions had to be managed. No, I'm quite comfortable, he said. She hesitated for just a second before nodding. He watched her as she walked away. Watched the way she whispered something to another attendant. How their eyes flickered toward him. How they nodded in quiet understanding. He had seen this before. A decision had been made. The illusion of order would be restored. One way or another. And just as he was considering this, another shift occurred. The businessman beside him, who had spent the last hour pretending to read his newspaper, let out a small sigh. I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this, he muttered. David turned to look at him. Slow and deliberate. A big deal? The man shrugged, still not quite meeting his eyes. These things happen. People make mistakes. No need to make it into something more than it is. David let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Tell me, he said, how many mistakes have you had to ignore in your life? The man frowned. That's not what I meant. But it is, David said, his voice calm. You want me to let this go? Because it makes you uncomfortable. The businessman opened his mouth. Then closed it again. David leaned back in his seat. The funny thing about silence, he said, more to himself than to the man beside him, is that it never actually quiets anything. It just gives people the illusion that something has disappeared. A few rows ahead, the young woman who had hesitated before finally turned. She met his gaze. And this time, she did not look away. David had spent his life learning the language of silence. Not just the absence of words but the weight of what was unsaid. The glances exchanged between two men who didn't expect him to sit beside them. The hesitant pause and a handshake that lasted a fraction too long. The polite distance that people maintained as if his presence in their space was something to be tolerated, not accepted. And yet, silence could be loud. Loud in the way a room shifts when a black man enters. In the way the air inside an airplane tightens when he refuses to shrink himself. And right now, in the stale recycled air of the cabin, silence was deafening. David was still seated in his first-class seat, still poised with the kind of calm that had taken him decades to master. The businessman beside him had folded his newspaper neatly on his lap, pretending to read an article he had long since finished. The young woman in front of him had turned once, hesitant, and then again, more certain. She wanted to say something. He could feel it, but she didn't. Not yet. Across the aisle, the flight attendant who had dismissed him earlier, the same one who had offered him a false kindness just minutes ago, was whispering again, this time, to the senior attendant, a man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of practiced authority that came from years of being listened to. They spoke in hushed tones. David could see it in the slight tilt of her body, the tension in her jaw. She was not asking. She was justifying, defending, explaining away something that should have been left to stand on its own. David knew what was coming before it happened. Sir, the senior flight attendant said as he approached. His voice measured, careful. Would you mind stepping to the galley for a moment? I'd like to have a quick word. David exhaled slowly, pressing his fingertips together. Here it was. The polite removal. The gentle attempt to restore the illusion of normalcy by making the problem, him, disappear. He turned his head slightly, glancing toward the businessman beside him, then to the young woman who had been watching. And then, he smiled, because he wasn't going anywhere. I'd prefer to have our conversation right here, David said. His voice was even, steady. The senior attendant's expression flickered, just for a second, before smoothing over. There's just been some confusion, he said. I want to clear it up. I have no confusion, David replied. I know exactly what happened. The businessman beside him shifted, uncomfortable. The young woman in front of him was listening now. Her body half turned. The moment stretched, thin and unyielding. The flight attendant, Rachel, her name tag read, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching, waiting. And David understood then. This wasn't just about this flight. It never was. This was about all the other flights before it. All the restaurants, all the boardrooms, all the schools, all the small, sharp edges of a world that told people like him that they were only welcome under certain conditions. Conditions that he refused to accept. No, sir, David said finally, his voice a little louder now. I won't be stepping anywhere. The businessman turned his head now, fully looking at him for the first time. The young woman inhaled sharply. A ripple moved through the cabin. Passengers glanced up from their books, their screens, their rehearsed distractions. Because something was happening. David could feel it. And so could they. There were moments in a man's life when he realized that silence was no longer an option. David sat in his first-class seat. Still, but not quiet. His very existence, his refusal to shrink, to yield, to accept the unspoken rules of the world around him, was speaking louder than any argument he could offer. And yet, the senior flight attendant still wanted him to disappear. The businessman beside him had long since abandoned his newspaper, though he still held it in his hands as if clutching it could make him invisible. Across the aisle, the young woman, who had turned once, then twice, was now fully facing him. There was a charge in the air, something unspoken shifting among the passengers. Rachel, the flight attendant who had humiliated him earlier, stood a few feet away, her arms folded across her chest. The senior attendant, his voice calm, measured, rehearsed, leaned in ever so slightly, as though softening the moment might make David reconsider. I understand that you feel uncomfortable, the senior attendant said, lowering his voice as if offering a personal kindness. But we don't want any disruptions. If you'd like, we can move you to a more private area where we can. Quote, where can you do what? David cut in, his voice steady. Escort me off the plane? Tell me it was all a misunderstanding? Ask me to be grateful for your professionalism? A murmur rippled through the cabin. A businessman in the row ahead turned his head ever so slightly. The young woman swallowed hard. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The weight of the moment had shifted. David had seen this before. Lived through it too many times to count. The attempt to make the problem go away by pretending it never existed. He wasn't having it. The senior attendant sighed, glancing back toward Rachel. She wouldn't meet his eyes. David saw it then. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was afraid. Because she knew. She knew what she had done. And worse, she knew that everyone around her had seen it, too. A voice broke the tension. This isn't right. It was the young woman in front of him. Soft at first, but sure. The businessman beside him shifted, glancing at her, then at David. Another voice joined in. He's been sitting here quietly this whole time. A man from the next row over. Then another, and another, until the murmur turned into something undeniable. Until the cabin was alive with it. And Rachel, the flight attendant who had tried to reduce him to an inconvenience, had nowhere left to hide. David turned his gaze to her. Slow, deliberate, and for the first time, she looked small, because she had spent her life believing she could treat people like him however she wanted and that the world would agree with her. But today, the world did not. Today, the world has turned, and she was the one who didn't belong. David did not move. He did not blink. He simply let the weight of the moment settle around them. Like the final note of a song no one had expected to hear. Rachel, the flight attendant who had ridiculed him, humiliated him, dismissed him as if his presence were a mistake, stood frozen. She had played this game before. She had smirked at men like him. She had spoken to them in clipped, condescending tones, just loud enough to make sure others understood who held the power. And it had always worked. Until now, the murmur in the cabin had become something undeniable. A shift, a recognition. The passengers weren't looking at David anymore. They were looking at her. The businessman beside him, the young woman across the aisle, the man in the expensive suit who had first refused to make eye contact. Each of them now understood what they had seen. David could feel it. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the times people like Rachel had gotten away with it. And now, she was the one shrinking. The senior flight attendant, who had spent the past several minutes trying to make this problem go away, suddenly realized that it wouldn't. He cleared his throat. Sir, he said, this time his voice softer. The edge gone. I'd like to apologize for any misunderstanding. David tilted his head. Is that what this was? He asked. A misunderstanding? The silence was thick. The passengers waited. Rachel's hands were clenched at her sides. The smirk was gone. The certainty had drained from her eyes. And David, for the first time since this all began, felt something shift. This was not about a seat. This was about the lie Rachel had told herself her entire life. The lie that said she could treat men like him any way she wanted. And that the world would always nod along. But the world, today, has changed its mind. David exhaled slowly. He could have made a speech. He could have demanded she be removed. That she be punished. He could have held onto his anger like a weapon and swung it until it hit its mark. Instead, he turned to the passengers around him. The ones who had watched. The ones who had hesitated before speaking. The ones who had finally found their voices. And he nodded. Thank you, he said. A simple thing, but enough. Rachel flinched as if the words had cut deeper than any accusation. The senior flight attendant adjusted his tie. If there's anything I can do to, quote, there is, David said, his voice steady. You can remember this. And with that, he turned back to his seat. He did not need their apologies. He did not need their approval. Because they had already given him what mattered most. They had seen. And now, they could never again pretend they hadn't.